I'm here today with Nicholas Wapshott. We're going to discuss his new book, Keynes Hayek, The Clash That Defined Modern Economics. Thanks for joining us.
Pleasure.
So let's start back at the beginning, Keynes and Hayek in the 1930s. Very, very different views to a traumatic episode. How did you see each of them respond to the challenge of the slump in the Great Depression?
Well, they both came out of the Great War, and they both found themselves on opposite sides of the Great War, and their experience in the aftermath of that Great War was Keynes was preoccupied with trying to cure unemployment. He was very anxious about unemployment and what that might lead to. He thought it might lead to extreme politics, radical politics. An example, of course, in the First World War of the war spilling over into dangerous times was the Bolshevik Revolution and so on. Hayek found the same thing from the other side, but he was anxious. His post-war experience was one of rapid inflation, which he also thought would lead to extreme politics. And his personal circumstances, his own family had their fortune wiped out by inflation, and the Austrian government that he lived under also collapsed and was in dire straits as a result of that. And so they both came at the same problem, that is the clash and the collapse of 1929, with different competing views about exactly what the best way of fixing that would be. Keynes was way ahead of the game, really. He had started his thinking and was running very fast with ideas. He couldn't keep up with his own thoughts. He was writing books, which as soon as he'd written the book, they were already out of date in his mind. Hayek tried to keep things simple, and they actually came to clash with each other thanks to the London School of Economics, which looked at King's College, Cambridge, which is where Keynes was doing his great work, and said, we would like to set ourselves up as the contra-Keynes, the counter-Keynes. And they sent for Hayek. They actually might have sent for Ludwig von Mises, the great free market economist, but for a number of reasons he wasn't entirely suitable. So they found the next best thing, which was Friedrich Hayek. And Hayek was sent for like a gunslinger and brought to London in order deliberately to bring down the ideas of Keynes.
But he was really fighting with one heck of a gunslinger in Keynes. Keynes was a great orator, very clever, sometimes very cruel sense of humor.
Absolutely, yeah. He found out very soon, of course, that when you start tangling with Keynes and the Keynesians, it was not going to be a walk in the woods. I mean, Keynes was a panther. He was totally unforgiving. He was brought up in an English public school tradition where sarcasm was probably the least in your armory. And they went at each other through learned journals, but it was so rude, it was so ungentlemanly between the two of them that fellow academics said, they tried to call a halt. Please, this is not the way to behave. Try to temper your language. This isn't a good way to proceed. But the fact was that Keynes felt himself, I think, rightly under attack from Hayek. Hayek, I think, maybe didn't understand everything that Keynes was trying to tell him, and therefore answered in his critique of Keynes's earlier works. Hayek answered something that actually didn't exist. That is, he answered what he understood to be what Keynes was trying to tell him, which of course was a different thing. And Keynes said, hold on a minute. I don't think that you're giving me the sort of leeway, the understanding that anyone might expect, and you do it in such vituperative terms that I'm not sure that I really have to spend too much time listening to you anymore. And so the thing, finally, the actual debate between them ground to a halt after a while, with one talking about apples and the other talking about pears. They just didn't have a common ground. But the essence of what they were saying, though, was important, and it actually did provide a fork in the road between the two great traditions. And that was that in the terrible circumstances, in the post-economic crash of 1929 circumstances, with mass unemployment throughout Europe, throughout the United States, government had to think carefully about what to do if it was to avoid drifting into extreme politics and authoritarianism. And what Keynes said was that you really have to, he worked out a reason for doing what a number of other people had said, actually, in terms of common sense, really. And that is, if the private sector can't employ people, then the public sector could. What Keynes did was to provide a totally, more than plausible, a convincing theory for why this made perfect economic sense. And what he said was, if the aggregate demand for goods is too low, what the government must do is to replace that demand. And if you don't have the money for it, it really doesn't matter because it's only money. What you can do is to borrow the money, and you can pay the money back later. Better to save your neck right now and save the world right now and work out later what the problems are about having borrowed too much, rather than put up with what might be a tragedy in terms of the way that the world might collapse and fall into the sort of street fighting and disintegration of civilization that in the 30s was on the cards. I mean, when you
it's
had...
It's interesting because today it feels like we're unlearning that lesson and we're tempting fate.
Well, this is being recorded when the London is now just enjoyed 3 days of riots, and I must say...
Enjoyed.
I know. Civilization is much more fragile than you can imagine. When a country as deeply civilized, with such a strong civic society, with a phlegmatic population as London, can spill so easily into widespread thuggery and looting and thievery, you do wonder whether all of the suggestions that somehow we can do without government, that it's not important, that the people at the top can run the business as they like and take no account of the great mass of the population, that they're playing with fire.